Hey everyone, welcome to this free course where I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about Cloudflare Workers. In the next hour or so, we're going to walk through creating a new Cloudflare account, making your first Cloudflare Workers application, and even adding some interesting stuff like Hono, a full stack application framework for workers, as well as some nifty AI tools from Cloudflare AI. The only prerequisites for this course are that you have some basic command line knowledge, as well as some knowledge of writing JavaScript, though if you're not an expert, that's totally fine. We'll walk through things slowly so that you can understand what's going on. And by the end of this, you should have a really cool and interesting application that uses Cloudflare and Workers AI to build some sort of interesting AI generated text that you can use, whether it's an API for JSON, serving JSON responses, or in a UI that you can kind of send to people and show off using AI tools directly inside of the application. So I hope you enjoy, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Any source that we write inside of this will be available in the description of this video, linked to GitHub. Thanks so much, and here's my Twitter right here. If you want to ask any questions, you can reach out to me directly as well. So let's jump into it. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a new Cloudflare account. To do that, I'll just go to cloudflare.com and I'll click the sign up button. Now for this, you won't need any of the paid stuff inside of the Pro plan or the business plan. Everything in Workers and Workers AI is self-serve. I do believe that Workers AI may cost a little bit of money based on your usage, but you shouldn't get charged anything for kind of what we're building inside of this course. But if you want to go through and double check that, and you could also cancel your account afterwards if you don't want to incur any extra charges by leaving the account open or something like that. So for now, I'll click free. And once I get to the sign up page, I'll just enter an email. So I'll say kristiancloudflare@gmail.com and my password. And then I'll click sign up. And so now from here, it says, thank you for choosing Cloudflare. Get this cool little splash image. And I'll go down here to explore all products. And so to start, what we're going to do is set up our Cloudflare Workers subdomain and get our account all set up before we actually start generating any code. To do this, you can go to the sidebar and say Workers and Pages here. I'll need to verify my account real quick. So I'll come here and check my email. So I can click this email verification real quick. Okay, and once my account is verified, I'll be able to go back and go to Workers and Pages, and you can see thanks for verifying your email address. So from here, I can get started creating either my first Workers project. We're going to be working inside of Cloudflare Workers today, which is our serverless functions platform. But there is also another tool here called Pages, which allows you to deploy full stack applications like a React application, a Next.js application, all sorts of other frameworks. And you can do that by either connecting to Git, so you can connect to GitHub or Bitbucket and deploy directly from your repositories, or you can upload assets directly. So if you have some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you want to upload, you can literally drag and drop it onto the Pages UI and just deploy it immediately to Cloudflare's network, which is pretty cool. So let's start by creating our first worker. And so what I can do is I can give it a name here. So by default, it's Worker Late Mountain. If I refresh here, you can see it'll actually get a unique name each time. And it'll generate some code as well. And you can see what that looks like here. And I'll just click deploy. And you can see that my first worker has been deployed to region Earth. So these are all of the locations that the worker will be served from. So it's going to be super low latency and really fast. And that's one of the advantages about deploying with Cloudflare Workers, is that your serverless functions aren't just deployed to one region, they're deployed to all of our different sort of points of presence around the world. So it'll be super low latency whether you're here in Texas area like I am, or you're down in Australia or Asia or wherever you may be, or wherever your users may be as well. It'll be super quick to deploy and to get a response back from your applications. Every single user of Cloudflare Workers gets their own unique subdomain. Mine is kristiancloudflare.workers.dev, and that's of course based on my email that I gave it. And so every time you want to deploy workers, say you don't have a custom domain available, or you want to have sort of a preview or test deployment, you can deploy that to this little subdomain here, and that way you can sort of keep things, maybe you're still working on a project, it's not quite done yet, or whatever it may be. You have this subdomain that you can deploy things to. If I come back to the workers section here, you can see I have a list of all of the different projects I've deployed. So as you make more projects, this will be populated, obviously, with all the different things you've deployed. And if I open up a specific worker here, I can see all of the information about this worker. So things like metrics for requests and sub requests. I can configure new routes or all kinds of triggers and things like that here, all of which is explored in our documentation, which I'll put a link to in the description, and you can check out how that all works. Okay, so now that we've set up our Cloudflare account, we've verified it, and we've even deployed our first worker just to see how that process works, let's move to the command line and get started writing code. So in order to generate projects for Cloudflare Workers or even for Cloudflare Pages, we have a really nifty tool that I'm going to show you how to use that's kind of a wizard for deploying new Workers and Pages applications. So all you need to have is npm installed. If you don't know how to do that, there is a lot of information in our Get Started guide, which I'll link in the description of the video. But all you need to do is run npm create Cloudflare. And then once you do that, you'll be able to, and you can see I maybe don't have the most recent version of npm or node. That's okay, it should still work, but you can check out the supported versions here and update and upgrade if you need to. But I'm using Create Cloudflare version 2.0.8. So at time of recording, that's the version I'm going to be using. I'll show you all the versions that I'm using just in case something changes, but it should stay pretty consistent even if there's new versions of whatever we're trying to use here. So step 1 of 3, create an application with Cloudflare. Where do you want to create your application? Also used as application name. So kind of like our other project, you'll have a sort of unique name for your application, which you can either keep just by pressing enter, or I can give it a different name. So I'll just call this one Workers Getting Started, and then I'll press enter. So now we have this directory that's going to be created called Workers Getting Started. And now I have a type of application that I want to create. So there's a couple high-level options here. So website or web app, that's going to be a Cloudflare Pages application. So let's say you want to create a Next.js project or an Astro project or whatever framework you want to use, React even. You can do that from directly inside of here. You can also set up a Hello World script. That's going to be the one that we're going to use here in just a second, as well as common worker functions. So if you're new to Cloudflare Workers, like you probably are if you're watching this video, this is a great option to see all the different things that workers can do. And then finally, we even have a ChatGPT plugin written in TypeScript if you want to work with some external AI tools. So for now, I'm going to select Hello World script. And now it'll ask me 2 follow-up questions. 1, do I want to use TypeScript? In this case, I'll say yes. It'll get started creating the application. So it'll copy the files from the template, and then it will install dependencies, which is step 2 of 3. It just uses npm, so it's everything if you're a JavaScript developer that you're familiar with. And then finally, it'll say, do you want to deploy your application? In this case, I'm going to say no, and I'll show you why here in just a second. And you can see that it's not going to deploy the application, but in the future, I can run npm run deploy if I want to. Now, a couple last things that it tells you to check out. So 1, run the development server using npm run start. Deploy your application, that's npm run deploy. Read the documentation. This is developers.cloudflare.com/workers, which I'll link in the description as well. It has all sorts of tutorials and reference documentation to help you understand workers and how to deploy more things with it. And then finally, a link to our Discord, discord.gg/cloudflaredev, which I'll also plug at the end of the video as well. So there's like, I don't know, it's a lot of people, maybe 40,000 people or something like that in that Discord talking about developing with Cloudflare. So if you're stuck, that's a great place to check out too. Okay, so last thing is we will cd inside of that directory. So Workers Getting Started, and we can take a look at what's inside of this application. So we have a node modules folder. That's obviously our dependencies for our project, packagelock.json and package.json, which is our configuration for our JavaScript project. tsconfig.json, since we're using TypeScript, we have a TypeScript configuration file here. And then finally, the source directory, which is obviously our actual application code, as well as Wrangler toml, which is the configuration for Wrangler. So what is Wrangler? So you didn't maybe get a glimpse at it because it was sort of abstracted away behind these npm run scripts. But if I open up package.json here and take a look at it, make this text size a little bit bigger, you can see that there's 2 scripts inside of here. So deploy, which is just an alias essentially to Wrangler publish, as well as start, which is an alias to Wrangler dev. And then here in the dependencies, we have Wrangler 3.0, which is the dependency for obviously integrating with Wrangler. So Wrangler is our command line tool for managing all of your Cloudflare application stuff, whether that's workers or pages, or D1, which is our serverless database, KV, which is our key value store, whatever it may be, R2, our blob storage provider. There's all sorts of stuff inside of Wrangler, and you can access it from just running npx Wrangler. Make the text size a little bit smaller here so you can see there's all sorts of stuff here. So like I said, there's R2, D1, there's AI models, hyperdrive, there's all sorts of things in here, as well as some basic subcommands for managing your worker as you're building it. So Wrangler dev starts a local server for developing your worker. Wrangler deploy is what actually deploys your application. Wrangler secret allows you to set secret values such as API keys and stuff like that you don't want to have exposed in plain text. There's all sorts of things here that you can do inside of the Wrangler CLI. Now, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to log into Cloudflare. So we created our project, but we're not authenticated yet to that Cloudflare account that we created. And so to do that, I'm going to run npx Wrangler login. It's going to actually open a new tab for me automatically, and then I'll get shown this screen where I can consent to allowing Wrangler to make changes to my Cloudflare account. So you can see it's going to have access to all this stuff. Well, that's okay. I want it to be able to manage basically everything inside of my Cloudflare account. So I'll say allow, and then I'll get redirected here to this page. You've granted authorization to Wrangler. Feel free to close this browser window. So I'll do that. You can see I successfully logged in. And then to make sure I've successfully logged in, I'll run npx Wrangler who am I. And you can see that it has this information. You're logged in with an OAuth token associated with my email, kristiancloudflare@gmail.com. So definitely do this once you authenticate for the first time, and make sure that you're connected to the right account or connected to an account at all, because that will be what allows you to actually deploy your application. Now, the last thing we need to do is deploy this application for the first time. And to do that, I'm going to say npm run deploy, which is just going to shell out here to Wrangler publish. And you can see here it actually says in this version of Wrangler that Wrangler publish is deprecated, and we'll be moving to Wrangler deploy instead. And so maybe we'll update that here in just a moment. But you can see that I have this URL here, workersgettingStarted.kristiancloudflare.workers.dev. And if I open it up here, it just returns this string hello world back. So it took us, 1 second to upload it, 4 seconds in total to publish it. And then at the end of that, we already have a URL here that is our deployed version of our application. So literally 10 seconds, 15 seconds or so overall between running npm run deploy and clicking the URL in my command line. And I already have something deployed to production, which is pretty awesome. So next, let's look at how we can actually work with our workers application locally in order to understand how we're changing the application and make sure that things work before we deploy it. The main command that we use to do that is npx Wrangler dev, or for short, npm start, which will actually just shell out to Wrangler dev. Now what this does is it sets up a local host server using a tool called Miniflare, which is a replication of the server sort of isolate technology that we're running on Cloudflare's servers. So when you deploy something to Cloudflare Workers, we have this, you can actually check it out on GitHub. It's called workerd. It's an open source JavaScript runtime, and it will use something very similar locally. And in fact, you can even pull down the full version of workerd if you want and run it, though it is significantly trickier than just using this built-in one. But you can run things locally and see, well, how is this actually going to work? Does it work at all before you deploy it, which is really handy. And so you can see that it's running on localhost 8787. Let's open that up. You can see on localhost 8787, it looks exactly the same as my application that was running here in my sort of production URL. And so that allows me to test things locally, which is great. Not only does it allow me to do things locally, but I can also do things like get logs and get live reloads. So I'm just running tmux here to have a kind of multiple tabs. That's what that change here is at the bottom. But let me open up my file here, source/worker.ts, and let's make a change here and see how it live reloads. So I'll say hello YouTube. I'll write that change, and then if I refresh here, you can see that that change has already happened. And then if I come back here, you can see it reloaded the local server as soon as I made a change. So I can do true local development and not have to kind of deploy, see the change, make a change locally, deploy it again, et cetera, et cetera. Some other cool things here. So right now this is running locally, but there are some instances where you do want to actually upload it to Cloudflare's servers and make sure that things work as you'd expect. The best use case for this is if you're working with things like D1 or KV or something like that, where you have this sort of specific integration that you're doing with one of Cloudflare's other developer tools, and you want to make sure that things actually work against those real services. And so I can test that by pressing the L key, which will actually turn off the local server and send the sort of deployed test version of our application up to Cloudflare's specific preview server. Now, what's interesting about this is if I refresh here, you can see it's still running at localhost 8787. The URL hasn't changed, but this is actually coming back from one of Cloudflare's preview servers. And so the way that you can tell this is if I open up my developer tools here, you can see I have this GET request to my local host path. It's the exact same request I made earlier. But if I come to the response headers here and take a look, you can see I'm actually getting the CF Ray ID, which is sort of like a unique identifier for this request, as well as the server Cloudflare response header. So you know that there's actually a response coming back from Cloudflare servers versus just running locally on your own machine. So although we have the true local preview, which I can again turn on by just pressing the L key again and going back to the local server. So this is like, I'm on an airplane and I'm developing locally, truly locally, and I need to make sure that I can do everything, on my machine. Or I can use the sort of preview mode in order to ensure that things are working with these external Cloudflare services that I want to integrate against. And finally, just to show that you can have access to console log and stuff like that, let me come back in here and I'll just say console log, hello from the local console. And I'll write that here. Again, I'll get a reload since it has live reload built in. And I'll just refresh one more time and I can see hello from the local console. Maybe I'll do something a little bit more interesting here, and I will instead console log, let's say json.stringify request.cf. Now, this is something we probably won't cover in this tutorial, but there is all sorts of interesting things inside of this request CF parameter, interesting information about the request that's coming in and all sorts of other things. If I refresh here, you can see, wow, there's a ton of information here. Things like region here, so you can see it's actually coming from region Texas. It even has a postal code attached to it, an as organization, which is my ISP. So this is like my actual ISP that I pay for, my home internet. And there's all sorts of sort of regional information and stuff like that that's really interesting. Score here is actually like a bot score. You can see I have this bot management object attached. I have a score of 99 here, which means it's 99% sure that I'm not a bot, which is pretty cool. So there's all sorts of information here that you can use to do stuff in your application. You can sort of conditionally route people. If I had a score of like 10 and it thought I was a bot, for instance, I could just terminate the request and just say like, you're a bot. I don't want you to access my application. There's all sorts of interesting stuff here that you can check out, and that's all in our documentation, which again is linked in the description. So finally, after I've removed that console log, I'll just press X here and shut down my local server. And so that will, that'll be kind of your introduction to local development, which we will use here as we continue to develop this application. So now that we've looked at the basics of creating an application as well as deploying it and previewing it and developing against it locally, let's actually look at what our Workers application code looks like and how to start sort of adding interesting things and building a true application inside of the source code. So back in my source/worker TS file, you can see there's all sorts of comments here showing how my application works and helping you get started with your application. So it says, welcome to Cloudflare Workers. Here's some instructions here. npm run dev to start a local development server. That's what we just did. Localhost 8787. We just looked at that as well. And then finally, npm run deploy to publish a worker. So this is all stuff we know at this point. I'll just delete this. And because we're using TypeScript, you can see the first thing that gets defined here is this env interface. So this is where we can add all sorts of bindings, which we'll cover in here in a little bit. You can sort of think of them as bindings to both external services and values. So what that means is if I'm connecting to something like R2 or KV, all of our external services inside of the Cloudflare dev ecosystem that I may want to use inside of this application, they are kind of referred to as bindings inside of this env interface. I'll show you what that looks like in practice when we add some AI stuff to this application in a little bit. You can also store both text values as well as secrets inside of these bindings. So for instance, if you're trying to integrate with an external API like ChatGPT or something like that, you can set up a secret value that gets is made available inside of this env. So for instance, like env.openAI API key, which means that you can use it inside of your application as you would any other variable without it being available in plain text, which is pretty handy. So for now, I'm going to clear all of this out, though there is great documentation in our Cloudflare Workers documentation for how all of these bindings work and how they get sort of added. But for now, I'm just going to keep this as an empty object for now, but we can come back and populate this later if we need to. Now, the second part of this is our actual application code. So this format here is what we call a module worker. And essentially what it is it's an object that gets exported as the default export of this file. Now inside of that, we have a collection of function handlers, which correspond to different events that come into our worker. Right now, we only have one, and this is sort of the primary one, which is called the fetch event. And this represents a new request that's coming in to our workers application. There's other ones such as a scheduled event, which is if you set up a sort of cron trigger style recurring function. So say every hour you want to run some piece of code, you would set up a new thing here called scheduled, and then you would run whatever code you want inside of that. But for now, let's just look at the fetch event, and it'll be the primary one that we use throughout the rest of this tutorial. So inside of that fetch event, we have a couple different parameters. So the first of which is request, and this represents a request coming in to our application. You can see it's all typed here. So we have this request, and we'll be able to check for all sorts of interesting things inside of that. And then we also have env, which is this interface here. That's any bindings or anything like that that we've set up. And then finally context, which has some interesting properties you can check out in the documentation for sort of configuring how this handler runs. For instance, when it decides to terminate after it's done all the stuff that you tell it to do inside of the function body. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we won't really do anything here. Finally, the response signature here, or the return signature for this function is just a promise. So it's asynchronous. You can see here from the async keyword, and it just returns a response. So inside of that, we always want to obviously return a response. And so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to say return new response with the text hello YouTube. So we could do all sorts of things here. We could say, for instance, make a database request. We could process input from the request. So if they send us like some data or like a query parameter or something like that, we can handle all of that different stuff, which I will show you how to do here in a little bit. But ultimately what you need to do here is always return a response. So you can kind of think of this as a request comes in. A request always comes in with some information maybe that we care about, or it's just a request with no particular interesting information, and it always needs to have a response that comes back. So that's sort of the basics there. And as I showed you earlier, well, we could change this text. We could say hello YouTube. We could also do something like return JSON. So if I wanted to say JSON stringify hello world, and so that's like a JSON payload there that's stringified into text. What I can also do here is add a second parameter, which is options for this response. And so this can take things like headers, for instance, which is an object, and then I can give it something like content type, which is application/JSON. So this allows you to do things like, for instance, send back files or JSON or whatever it may be, as well as set your own custom headers. So you have a lot of different things you can do here. In a little bit, I'm going to show you how to simplify this using a framework that's super popular in the Cloudflare ecosystem called Hono, which allows you to have sort of really basic, you can literally just say like return c.json, and then it'll just configure everything for you. But before we get to that, it's good that you understand how to sort of do this from scratch manually, kind of the long form way, so that when you get into the short version of everything, you still kind of understand what's going on under the hood. So finally, let's take this version and we'll run npm run deploy. It'll bundle everything up. You can see it's really small, so it's gzip down to 0.22 kilobytes, which is a super small application. As we start to add dependencies, this will obviously grow, but Wrangler will take care of bundling everything for your application, so there's no additional steps there. If we come back here and we refresh, you can see that this has been updated to a JSON style payload. And so although it looks the same here when I make this request, if I come here and I just do a curl here and then pipe it into the JQ tool, you can see that it's valid JSON, which is great. So before we add Hono and make this application a little more interesting, let's take a brief look at the last file that we haven't looked at yet in our application, which is the wrangler.toml file. So TOML, if you aren't familiar with it, it's sort of configuration file format similar to YAML that we use internally inside of Cloudflare Workers applications. There'll also be a wrangler.json that's going to be supported here shortly, I believe sometime this year. So if you don't like TOML and you don't want to work with it anymore, look out for that. That's coming soon. But the TOML file here is what configures our application. It has all sorts of interesting information, and it's also well documented. So if you open up the Wrangler TOML file, you can see how everything works. And if you need to come back and add something in the future, it's likely that there'll be good documentation for that you can check out, both here in the Wrangler TOML file, just as like here's literally how it looks. You can come in here and uncomment something if you need to, or you can check out the configuration page inside of our Cloudflare Workers documentation, which has really in-depth documentation for this file. So the things that we have set up here by default are name. Now name is the version here of this URL that sort of gets populated. So workers getting started .christiancloudflare.workers.dev. So that is this workers getting started here. That is the name of my application. And so that's how that sort of gets translated into the URL. This can be whatever you want. I believe there's probably some limitations, probably alphanumeric and stuff like that. It has to be URL safe. But as long as you don't have another application with the same name here, you can call this whatever you want. Main is obviously the main file of this project. So source/worker.ts, that tells Wrangler where to find the main file and sort of bundle everything that needs to get bundled. And then finally, the compatibility date. So the compatibility date is probably the trickiest part of this file. You can basically think of it as sort of the version of your project. And more specifically, it's like the version of the workers runtime that your project uses. So by default, this is going to get set to whatever date you created your application at. And as you work on this application over time, this will sort of stay stable, right? It won't change. It's going to be the date that you created your project. And what that allows you to do is make sure that as you continue to work on your project, the runtime of Cloudflare Workers, well, it may evolve, it may have new features, it may find bugs that they want to fix, but it may be that your application sort of depends on those bugs, right? Like it's meant to be stable. So for better or worse, you may have some feature of like how something in the runtime works that you kind of depend on to work the way that it does. And so what the compatibility date is it sort of locks your application to a specific version of the runtime. Now, the reason that this matters is we have this super in-depth compatibility date page in our documentation. If you go to the workers documentation and go to configuration, compatibility dates, we have this super in-depth page that talks about every single sort of change that we've made to the runtime and allows you to kind of opt in to those changes. And so, for instance, if we come down here to the change history, you can see we have these lists of things that have changed. So just a recent thing here, web crypto preserve public exponent field. So let's read this. It says, in the Web Crypto API, the public exponent field of the algorithm of RSA keys would previously be an array buffer. Using this flag, public exponent is a uint8 array as mandated by the specification. So what does this mean? Well, we had this field here inside of the Web Crypto API on the workers runtime, and we had this field that was of type array buffer. Well, according to specification, this should have actually been a uint8 array. And so it may be, well, I don't say your application's something with Web Crypto, and you say, hey, I've been building this. It depends on it to be array buffer. So the good news is if you have an application that was created before 2023-1201, then as long as you keep your compatibility date, prior to that, you aren't going to opt into this change unless you work with this specific flag. And so there's an additional thing here. We can set up compatibility flags inside of your Wrangler TOML. For instance, this flag here is crypto preserve public exponent if you want to enable it, or no crypto preserve public exponent. And so what you can do here is you can come in and you can add compatibility flags. I spelled that wrong. Compatibility flags, which is just an array, and you can sort of opt in piece by piece into whatever specific changes that you need. And so that's how compatibility dates and compatibility flags work. If you want to sort of lock yourself into a specific date just to make sure that nothing changes, well, all you have to do is nothing, basically, right? Just keep your compatibility date the way that it is. But if you need to, have specific changes you want to opt into, or you just want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of the runtime, you can come through and look at all of these changes that are sort of the delta between what your current compatibility date is and what today's date is, and just make sure that all of those changes are things that you don't, depend on in your application. So it's super useful, and although it's a little confusing to understand at first, it's actually implemented pretty straightforward in a way that makes sense. So the rest of this here is configuration for different services like KV namespaces, durable objects, R2 buckets. And if you want to check out how all of these work, we have really great documentation and tutorials to help you understand how to use KV and durable objects and things like that. The only thing you really need to understand, if I uncomment this out, to sort of understand the relationship here between the code and the configuration, is that anytime you expose something using a binding attribute here, for instance, my KV namespace, the corollary in your code that will become exposed is something like env.mykv-binding. So if I have this env.mykv-binding, I could do things like get, I could do things like set. And where does that come from? Well, it's based on the fact that my KV binding would be defined here inside of my env. So like my KV binding, it would be something like KV namespace or whatever the specific binding is. I don't know if that's exactly what it is, but it's something like that. So that's how that all works. And you can see that the binding here gets exposed, like I said, here in the env. Actually, I think I don't want to delete that. I just want to leave it empty. So that is the Wrangler configuration file. There's a lot of stuff inside of here, different bindings and integrations, as well as links to the different services that we have available. Things like queues. You can actually route to different workers. You can call different workers from inside of other workers, which is pretty cool. There's all sorts of things here. And so you can check that out if you want to understand everything that you have available to you inside of the workers runtime. Before we continue throughout the rest of this tutorial, we're going to add an AI binding and hopefully do some cool AI stuff here in a little bit. But I want to take a slight detour and show you my favorite tool for building applications using Cloudflare Workers, which is a full stack framework called Hono. So I'll go to the website here, hono.dev. And Hono is actually built by another developer advocate on my team named Yusuke. He's a really, really great developer who is super in tune with the workers runtime and how everything works. And he's built this framework that makes it really easy to build applications, using Hono inside of Cloudflare Workers. It will save you a ton of code and make things a lot easier to read. It's hashtag not sponsored or whatever. I just really, really enjoy using it. It makes my applications a lot easier to understand and a lot more fun to write. So another benefit is it actually runs on any JavaScript runtime. So although we're going to be using it here in Cloudflare Workers. It works in Node, it works on Dino and Bun. You can do all sorts of different places and deploy it. Has all sorts of middleware and things like that. You can write your own middleware. You can kind of think of it as like Express, the Node. I was gonna say the old Node framework. It's really not that old, but you know, in like web development terms, I guess it's old. But it's like Express for Cloudflare Workers, which is really useful. It's a really nifty tool to have. So to install it, we'll just run npm install Hono, and it'll install the package in just a couple seconds. Now let's actually add it to our application. So what I'm going to show you is sort of, this is the before, right? This is what the application looks like. You recall that it will serve JSON back that looks like this, hello world. With this content type application JSON, I'm going to show you the equivalent version inside of Hono. So to start, I'm going to say import Hono from Hono, and this will actually be, whoops, let's start this over. So I'm going to say import, and then I'm going to grab the Hono class from inside of the Hono package. So I'll just wrap that in curly braces here. And then I'm going to set up a new instance of my app. So I'll say const app equals new Hono. That's going to be my app instance. And actually, I'll put it down here just so it kind of, the interface is up here at the top. And then because this is TypeScript, I'm going to want to actually add this env interface as part of my types. So I'm going to say, hey, I have this env interface. I have these custom bindings that I'm going to be using. So make sure that you sort of factor that into how the application thinks about bindings and stuff like that. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is actually update this right here, some angle brackets here, and then pass in an object where I'm going to say bindings is set to env. And so what this will do is any bindings that I put inside of this env will sort of set the types for any bindings inside of my application. We'll see how that's useful a little bit later on. Now we can actually write our first endpoint for our application. So I can do that by just saying app.get, which takes two different parameters. The first of which is the URL or sort of path, which is just going to be the root route here, /. And then the second thing here is going to be a callback function. So this is going to have one argument, which is C. You can kind of think of this as like context. And inside of that, I'm just going to return c.json and then pass in my JSON here. So hello world. And that's all I need to do to return a JSON response. There's also things like c.text. I believe you can even do I believe you can even do c.html. There's all sorts of different things you can do here. C.text, c.html, or c.json. And all I have to do here is pass in whatever data I want to have as my JSON body. It'll take care of stringifying it. It'll set all the right content type headers and everything else that we care about. And then all I need to do here is just remove all of this code and export my app as the default export of this function. And that's all I need to do to set up my Hono application. It's really straightforward. And to prove that, let's run npm start, just like we did earlier. We'll set up our local host server. And if I refresh here, you can see I get my content back again, hello world. Let's actually open it up in the network request here. And you can see that I get this content length is set here, content type is set, both as application JSON with a character set of UTF-8. So it's significantly less code to do the same thing, 11 lines of code, even less if you were to like truncate it truly and not do like all of the, nice spacing and stuff like that, which makes it really straightforward to add new functionality to our application. So that's why I really like Hono and I recommend it for most Workers developers to help them get up and running really quickly. So now that we've set up our Hono application, let's get started adding our first binding, which is going to be the Cloudflare AI integration. So to begin, I'm going to come back here and let's close this local server for now. And I'm going to run npm install @Cloudflare/AI, which is our AI package that has all of the stuff that we need to build an application using Cloudflare AI. And then the next thing we need to do is set up our first binding. So let's open up Wrangler TOML, and then right here at the bottom of all of this information here, I'm going to set up my AI binding. Now to do that, all I need to do is set up this new section here called AI, and then pass in this attribute binding and set it to whatever I want. In this case, I'll just say AI. So the binding here is set to AI. Well, what does that mean? It means that inside of here, inside of my env, I need to set up AI, and give it the type that matches, the binding for my AI integration. For now, I'll just set this to any. And then what I can do is integrate my AI class from that AI package into my application as well. So I'll say import AI from Cloudflare AI. Make sure to match the quotes for people who are catching that on the video. You can see that it gets imported here at Cloudflare AI. Well, what can we do now? Inside of my function handler here, I can set up an integration between the AI binding that we've set up and the AI package that I've installed from Cloudflare AI. So I'll say const AI equals new AI, and then pass in c.env.ai. So c.env here is the interface to this env that we've set up here. And so anytime that we have a binding set up, I'll save this real quick. Anytime we have a binding set up here in my Wrangler TOML, such as the AI binding, it will become available at c.env. And so what we're doing here basically is we have this AI class, which has been imported from the Cloudflare AI package. And this is going to be sort of the interface to all of our AI models. And then we have the c.env.ai, which is the actual binding to our GPUs. So this is like sort of magic code that connects to all of the Cloudflare GPUs that are running these AI models. So with our AI binding setup, let's look at how we can actually start using the AI models that we have available in Cloudflare AI. So there's all sorts of really interesting models available. If you haven't checked it out yet, I would go to ai.cloudflare.com and you can see all the cool things that you can build. There are things like text generation. So we can ask, why do so many people like pizza? A question that has puzzled many a foodie. So you can generate text and things like that. You can do text to image. So you can give it some prompt here and say, cyberpunk cat. Well, let's generate an image that matches that. There's even speech recognition. So give it an audio file and translate it into text. You can sort of do like audio to text, things like that. There's all sorts of different options here. And let's go with one of our sort of tried and true, the thing that everyone is really excited about with AI right now, which is text generation. So this is kind of like your ChatGPT or something like that, where I give it a question of some kind and I can get some text back that I find kind of novel or interesting or useful. In this case, let's use the CF Mistral 7B model. It's super, super good. I would say in my experience personally, it is comparable to something like GPT 3.5. It's really powerful and quite fast. And so in order to do that, what we're going to do is use a new function here called ai.run. And this takes two different parameters here. The first of which is the name of the model. And then the second is a inputs. This is going to be where we actually give it our prompt. Now, every model that we run on AI Cloudflare is a little bit different. And so what I would recommend is that you go to the documentation. So it's just developers.cloudflare.com/workers-AI. And here in the models section, we'll have documentation for each individual model. So you can see how to do text to image, how to do speech recognition, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, let's look at the text generation model here. Let me shrink this a little bit just so you can see how things look. You can see we have all sorts of models here. And in this case, I'm just going to use the basic, looks like this one is using Llama, but we'll just swap the model out and it should work exactly the same. The important thing here is that we have a couple different arguments here that you need to pay attention to. So first of which we have these messages. Now, messages is just a list of messages with different roles to help guide the AI in how to run. So a system message here with a role set to system, it says content, you are a friendly assistant. This sort of guides the output of the AI. I could say, for instance, like, you are not a friendly assistant. Give me wrong answers, and it'll probably try and generate wrong answers. I could say, you are, a personal assistant tasked with helping me achieve my professional goals or whatever, and it will try and sort of guide the output to act in that way. So this is optional. You don't always have to pass this, but it can sort of help improve the output that you want from the AI model. The second here is the important one, which is the user role. And this is where you would actually ask it a question or do something kind of useful or interesting. For instance, what is the origin of the phrase hello world? So I'm going to actually copy this. I think it's a good starting point. But you can see here the second argument here to AI run, that's that inputs that we started setting up in our code. In this case, it takes a couple arguments here. Messages is going to be these messages, and then stream is going to allow us to actually stream output from the AI. So there's good examples here in the documentation of how to set up streaming responses. I think it's a little out of scope for this introductory tutorial, so I won't focus on it here, and I just won't provide it. I'll just say, I won't even pass this, and it will just default to what we'd call a blocking response, which means it'll just wait until the response is completed and then return it to you. Okay, so let's paste in these messages here. So role system, role user, that all looks good. Looks like the indentation's fine. It's just my text size that's a little weird. And then inside of my inputs here, I'm just going to pass in messages. So this is a shorthand here that is sort of equivalent to messages set to messages. I can just sort of shrink it here like that. So we have this inputs, which is an object, and inside of that we have this messages array. Now we want to actually capture this response, right? So we have const response equals AI.run. Now the issue with this is that this is something that takes time, right? It's a asynchronous request that needs to go out and talk to Cloudflare's GPUs and run the model and sort of wait for the output to come back. And the way that we handle that is by turning this into, turning this into an asynchronous function by adding the async parameter or a keyword to this callback function, and then awaiting the response of this AI.run. And that's all we need to do to make this an asynchronous function. And now the final thing we need to do is, obviously we don't want to just return this hello world back. Let's actually replace this with the response from our AI model. Now I already have this, local server running here. You can see I'm getting this warning about how I can run with AI models locally. It says using Workers AI always accesses your Cloudflare account in order to run AI models, and so will incur usage charges even in local development. That's okay. As I said earlier, if you want to kind of shut down your account or delete this function or whatever after the fact, you can do that if you are worried about incurring charges. But for the amount we're using it, we should incur little to no charges. We're going to run this function like once or twice to confirm that it works. So let's go back to localhost. I'll refresh here, and you can see it's going to take a second. It's actually generating output, and it's waiting for that response to be completed before it sends it back here to me, the user. So it says response. The phrase hello world is a classic example of a program that prints hello world to the console when executed. So it's, an explanation of all this stuff. And so that is our first AI generated output. So if we come back and review what we did here, we actually learned a bunch of interesting stuff just in this little section through using the AI integration. So first we set up this binding. We made that available in Wrangler TOML by saying binding equal to AI. And then we imported this AI package and passed in the binding as sort of the interface to Cloudflare's GPUs for running these models. Second, we set up these messages and then the input. And then altogether, we ran AI.run, passing in the name of this model here and the inputs to tell it how to guide this AI model into generating some output here that we called response and returning it here in this JSON body. Now, this is all good, but this is kind of a boring, every time I make a request here, it's going to do something, not something, it's going to do the same thing over and over again, which is just answer, what is the origin of the phrase hello world? So what if we took this and we made it a little bit more interesting? I'm going to cut this out here, and I'm going to say const content, and I'm going to give it that string. And then what I'll do here is I will just pass this as a variable. Again, this is sort of like line 20, where I say this is equivalent to content set to the variable content. And I can just drop that here like that. Now, I might want to have this as one option of how to generate some content for my AI model. But what if I want to actually pass in information? What if I want it to be dynamic? Now, the easiest way to do that is if I make a GET request to my / route here, right, my root path, what I might want to do is support a query parameter where I can say query equals, how's your day today or something like that, right? Whatever I may want to pass in here. And so in doing that with workers, we would do that with query parameters, right? So this is equivalent to a query parameter. I'm sure you've seen this browsing the web. Query parameters are very ubiquitous. Now in vanilla workers, what we would do is something like const URL, new instance of the URL class. We have request.url. So let's take the URL that's coming in, turn it into a URL class, say URL, search parameters, get, query. We would capture all of that. And then we'd be able to say, okay, this is, our query here. We can actually use it inside of our code. So there's a lot of stuff you need to do, and this is all supported in the documentation, by the way. You can check that out. But what I love about doing this in Hono is it's super straightforward. I can just say something like const content equals c.request.query, and then pass in the name of the query parameter here, which is just query. And that's all I need to do in order to get that. C.request.query. Now I may want to have an actual fallback here, so maybe we'll say if that's not set, then just say or what is the origin of the phrase hello world. And so now I can have dynamic stuff coming back from my AI model. To test that, let's actually come here and let's set a query parameter. So I'll say slash query equals how is your day today. I'll press enter. Oh, that did not work. Let's try that. I'll add HTTP. There we go. My browser decided to search for it. Hello, I'm just a computer program, so I don't have a physical day, but I'm always here to help you with any questions or tasks you have. How can I assist you today? So that's funny. That's pretty straightforward. Now, what I can do here is I can see that it's getting encoded into a URL-friendly, version of this. What I could also do is do this in the command line. So maybe I'll say curl local. Actually, instead of using curl, I'll use HTTP, which is a really popular tool for this. You can do it with curl directly. Like if I just paste it in that thing there, I could do it that way. But with HTTP, what I can do is something like HTTP localhost 8787 query equals how do I bake a chocolate chip cookie? And all I have to do is pass that in that format, and it'll go and make that request. So you see it'll take a second here as it generates that output. Now, the longer the output is going to be, the more time it takes to generate that text, right? So you may want to move to streaming so you don't wait for a long period of time for it to generate all these instructions. So baking chocolate chip cookies is a fun and easy process, etc., etc. And so what I'm doing here by running it like this, query equals how do I bake a chocolate chip cookie? You can see that it is actually making a request. And in this case, it doesn't actually show the query parameter here, but you can see it took 16 seconds to generate the text. That is generating output from the AI based on this query parameter. Now, the final thing we can do is deploy this, right? So npm run deploy. Just like we've done in the past, but this time we have more interesting information here, which is great. Your worker has access to the following bindings. Well, we have an AI binding here, and it's set to the name AI. Well, that matches what we know here. We have c.env.ai, so we know that that's correct, right? That's the name of our binding, and Wrangler has already sort of figured that out. And you can also see that the upload here, it's grown significantly in size. Still pretty small, right? 25 kilobytes, but it was like 0.2 kilobytes before. Why is it significantly larger? Well, we've added the Hono package, and we've also added the Cloudflare AI package. So we've added both of those here, but ultimately it still gets deployed in just a couple seconds. And if I open this URL, you can see that it's actually going to generate AI output this time. Now, in this case, I didn't give it a query parameter of any kind, so it's going to go back to that fallback talking about hello world. But I have deployed this to production now, and I could access this, or you could send this to your friends and say, hey, I built an AI application. You want to fund me for $100 billion or whatever. The space is crazy right now. So that's how that all works. And with that, we've deployed our first kind of interesting AI-based application with Cloudflare Workers, using bindings in particular to connect our Workers application to some of the interesting things that we have in the Cloudflare ecosystem. Now, last but not least, I want to show you some of the cool things you can do with your Workers applications once you've actually deployed them. So if I go back to this space here and check out my sort of Workers breakdown page for my function, you can do all sorts of interesting things with Workers applications that we didn't cover here. One one of those is custom domains. So if you have a Cloudflare account where you have a custom domain connected to it, you can do things like run your workers function on a subdomain, or even write directly on your domain. For instance, you could set up ai.kristianfreeman.com, and you could say, hey guys, this is my AI project. You can run your workers function directly on that domain, and it only takes a couple clicks. In this case, I don't have any websites attached to this account, right? So I can't do that here. But you can check out the documentation for using custom domains, and that'll allow you to do that. You can also add, as we talked about earlier, things like cron triggers. Say you want to generate some AI response based on some information in your application. If you have a database attached or something like that, you could say every hour, go and query my database, get that information back, and then I'm going to write this sort of AI prompt that says, look at all this information and generate some output, and maybe you want to like text it to yourself or run it in a Slack channel or something like that. You can do that on a periodic basis using cron triggers. You can also do things like email triggers. So you can handle incoming mail and say, hey, if someone sends me an email, summarize it using AI and write me an email back that says, here's all the emails you got today, and something like that. That's actually a project that I've built, and if you find that interesting, let me know in the comments. I would love to do a video on that if you find that interesting. And then finally, there's all sorts of other integrations you can do here. Things like queues. So you can handle stuff in a queue. Say you have 100,000 people generating AI responses and you need to start like queuing them up so that your server isn't overrun with requests. You can do things like that. You can connect to other workers projects. Maybe you have another project that you need to be able to call from inside of your application. All this stuff is available here, and we have documentation for all of it as well. And then the other thing you can do is check out your metrics here. So you can see we ran about 11 requests here inside of the time in this course. Somewhat remarkably, it seems like I didn't generate any errors in production, which might be a first for me in doing a tutorial like this. Looks like all of my errors were done locally, so this is a great chart right now. It's looking good. You can see how long it takes for things to execute, how many requests are being made, and things like that. There's all kinds of other metrics here. If you use our state and coordination tool, Durable Objects, you can see the metrics for that here as well. And again, there's all sorts of things you can do here. You can see the last time we deployed this was via Wrangler. There's a lot of information here that is really helpful. So definitely check out this page once you've deployed your application. There's all sorts of additional things that you can do here. The last two places that I want you to check out are the Cloudflare Workers documentation. You can find this at developers.cloudflare.com/workers. And this is documentation that has been worked on since the beginning of Cloudflare Workers launching. We have years and years of tutorials that you can check out. You can do things like build OpenAI models that are fine-tuned. You can connect to external databases like Fauna, things like that. There are so many tutorials here, literally going back. It says 3 years, but I can tell you that I worked on this tutorial almost 5 years ago. And so all of these tutorials have stayed up to date. There's all kinds of things that you can check out here to build interesting applications using Cloudflare Workers. And if at any time you get stuck, say for things like Wrangler, you want to understand more how to use Wrangler, or things like what are your configuration options? What runtime APIs do you have available? Did you know, for instance, that we have a whole cache layer that you can use in order to interface with Cloudflare's caching layer? You can do things like headers or HTML rewriter. You can literally take incoming HTML and rewrite it in a streaming API inside of Cloudflare Workers. You can literally translate things on the fly using HTML, rewriter, things like that. There's so many things you can do, and all of it is available here in the documentation. So definitely check that out. I think you will find it really interesting and a great next step in your Cloudflare Workers journey. Finally, if you go to discord.cloudflare.com, you can join the Cloudflare Developers Discord. There are literally 40,000 people in that Discord, which is pretty amazing considering I remember when we started it and it was me and our community manager in the Discord. Now there's 40,000 people in there, which is pretty remarkable. And in this Discord, you can talk about all of the different Cloudflare developers products. So if you built something cool, I would definitely love to see it in the Discord. You can definitely share it there. If you have questions about things like Workers AI, Wrangler, or just deploying applications, custom domains, whatever it may be, it's a great place to ask questions. Or if you want to just understand what other people are building with all the Cloudflare developer tools, you can do that here as well. So just go to discord.cloudflare.com. You could probably also just Google search Cloudflare Discord. I'm sure you could find it there as well. And you can join us there and start asking questions and meet the rest of our amazing community. So I hope you found this course interesting and useful. Let me know in the comments if I got anything wrong, if there's any typos. I'm sure there's one or two of them out there. I'll let you know in the description if I messed anything up. Too bad. Personally speaking, love building with Cloudflare Workers, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a developer advocate here. I think it's one of the quickest ways to get really fun applications and ideas out there into production all around the world with low latency and all kinds of really awesome and interesting performance characteristics. Now, in this tutorial, we didn't go into all of the interesting sort of low-level technology stuff about Cloudflare Workers. But again, in our documentation, you can check all of that stuff out. Maybe you're interested in Cloudflare Workers security model. Well, you can go check that out in the documentation as well. You can learn about isolates and all of the cool stuff that we've done to make Cloudflare Workers both secure and extremely performant. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the Cloudflare channel if you find it interesting. And we have all kinds of other videos, not just from me, but from other developer advocates on the team. We're building all sorts of interesting stuff every single day, and I'll see you in the next one.